Welcome to the Falling Walls plenary table, Food Security, the Path of the Hunger Hurricane.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and also from me, a very warm welcome to this plenary table on food insecurity, the path of the hunger hurricane. I'm Melinda Crane, and it is a great pleasure to accompany you today as moderator. I think you hardly need a reminder from me. Fighting world hunger has never been more urgent. Just one example why: the sharp spike in wheat and corn prices last week after Russia announced that it would be leaving the deal guaranteeing safe passage for grain exports from Ukraine. That sent prices soaring. They did come back down when Russia said that it would rejoin the deal, but the spike is a worrying reminder that food supply remains vulnerable and volatile. The war and its effects are among a series of shocks, including COVID and the climate crisis, that have turned 2022 into a year of what the World Food Program calls unprecedented hunger. How can we avert a famine that threatens the lives of 50 million people right now? What policies and innovations can stop the hunger hurricane in future and sustainably expand future food supply for all? Those are our key questions here this morning, and with us is an outstanding panel to help us address them. I will now introduce them one by one and ask them to please join me here at the table. Alex Asenva-Vo is the first executive secretary of the Côte d'Ivoire Ghana Cocoa Initiative and previously served as director of corporate affairs for Europe and Africa at the company Mars. Alex, please join me. And we're very pleased to welcome Matthias Berninger. He is Bayer's executive vice president for, hi Alex, you can please take this seat right here if you would. Matthias Berninger is Bayer's Executive Secretary, Vice President for Public Affairs, Science, Sustainability and Health, Safety and Environment, and he is the driving force between Bayer's Global Sustainability Initiative. Matthias, please, exactly, that's the right seat. And Joachim von Braun is also with us. He's professor for economic and technological change at Bonn University Center for Development Research with a focus on food and nutrition security. And if you would kindly take that place right there. Thank you so much. And finally, it's such a pleasure to welcome Ertharin Cousin. She is founder and CEO of Food Systems for the Future, which advises governments and companies on how to improve food production and nutrition. And she was previously executive director of the United Nations World Food Program. Ertharin, no, if you could come here, please. We do have cameras in the round, so thank you. And before we start our discussion, ladies and gentlemen, just a very quick reminder from me. We are eager to hear your questions and comments. You can send them in to us online, and then our online moderator will join us a little bit later and bring them into the discussion. And now let me do just a super fast audience poll, if I may, to get us started. And dear audience, it basically asks for your assessment of the current level of food insecurity. The number of undernourished people worldwide was just short of 800 million when the world community signed up to the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015. So what I'd like to ask you is whether you think we're closer to the goal in the Sustainable Development Goals of ending world hunger by 2030. If you think we're closer now than we were in 2015. If you say yes, raise your hand now, please. If you think that the goal is receding, that we are further away, please raise your hand now. So we have a very well-informed audience with us today. Earthrin, in fact, there are currently around 830 million people struggling with food insecurity, and your old outfit, the World Food Program, has issued dire warnings that we are likely to see an increase in both famine and food insecurity. Why is the situation so grave, and what do we need to be doing right now to ameliorate it?
Well, I appreciate the audience recognizing that we're failing, that, in fact, we're going backwards, as you just noted. And prior to COVID, the challenge that we faced was climate and conflict were the two primary drivers of the increased number of people who are food insecure, undernourished, as you stated. Then you had COVID. And when lockdowns occurred, that affected access to nutritious food. And what we recognized was that our food system is efficient, but it's not very agile. And as a result, prices skyrocketed, making food more unaffordable and inaccessible by the most vulnerable people on earth, increasing the number of people who are food insecure. Then the conflict in Ukraine was a tipping point that created what many of us have called a perfect storm, that resulted in an even higher number of undernourished people. But that undernourishment number is not the one that should concern us most. The one that should concern us most is the number of people who are severely malnourished. And that number has increased up to 325 million people. And as you noted, those who are acutely hungry, on the verge of potentially starvation, is now ticking up to 50 million people. And so yes, we need to support the humanitarian response that WFP has called for. And I must applaud the global community because we still have not yet seen a famine declaration in Somalia despite the dire situation there, because the global community is providing humanitarian support. But the challenge is what I call preemptive humanitarian action, providing the support that is necessary before the crisis occurs.
Thank you so much. Let me go to Joachim. The German NGO Welthungerhilfe, of which you are the vice president, recently issued its own very dire warning in its Welthunger Index and said that we know what needs to be done to avert catastrophe, but we're not doing it. Why is that? What is it that needs to be done? What can we do right now to try to ward off a worsening of this situation?
Yeah, well, we need action at least in three areas. One is the trade agenda. We have had serious problems of getting the grains out of the Black Sea. That has made the markets extremely nervous and has led to increase in the prices, speculation on top of it, value chains disrupted by COVID, as Earthrin already mentioned. So this whole trade agenda is important, and it's very political. That's one of the why questions to address. So we need really strong emphasis on coalitions to overcome these blockades. Secondly, the developing world has drifted into a serious debt crisis. They no longer can finance social protection and nutrition programs. So money must come to the table for debt relief. WFP is doing a lot for humanitarian assistance. Welthungerhilfe is a partner. But national governments do the most, and they are currently seriously constrained. And third area of action is we need to really find short-term supply expansion. So sharing stocks, not hoarding. The big stockholders, China, Europe, India, US, need to share what they have. Share the scarcity and thereby bring calm to the market.
Thank you very much. We're going to dig deeper on a couple of those points. Let me go over to Alex now. And amongst the hunger hotspots at the moment are a number of countries in sub-Saharan Africa. Cocoa farmers are some of the poorest in the entire agriculture sector. As I mentioned, you work with cocoa farmers. Can you tell us what you're seeing right now on the ground?
Yes, thank you very much. we have to admit that currently it's extremely difficult. I'm coming from Ghana. I'm from Côte d'Ivoire, but living in Ghana. And a country that has an inflation that reached almost more than 40%. Right? The official number will come soon, but we may reach 50%. This is terrible. So that means everything is expensive. I went recently to the farm, and to look a bit positively, I met one of the best farmers. He was for 3 years a best cocoa farmer. His problem is very simple. He has been invested a lot in his farm, putting fertilizer, good practices, selling his cocoa. But today, as we speak, his main question is, I have to choose between buying fertilizer and investing in my farms, or putting my kids to school, right? Meaning food and everything related to this. So he is in this challenge, and this is one of the best farmers, right? So what is it for almost this 95% cocoa farmers that are living below under $100? That's the reality. And this is currently a situation that's great frustration, because the relationship, Westerns and our countries, shows that while this is happening, still in the cocoa sector, we have seen the past 3 years record profit for companies, right? While countries like us, Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana, main producer over 60% of the global productions, we have to subsidize the price we pay and to maintain the price that farmers should get. So that's a difficult, and this is a circle we're in right now.
And let me just ask for a very quick, deeper dive on that last point. In fact, smallholders' current share of earnings in cocoa is 6% of a global market that is worth $1 billion or more. Expanding that share basically means going head-to-head with global corporations, as you just mentioned, including, for example, your former employer, Mars. Are companies truly ready for redistribution? Joachim also talked about the need to change the terms of trade. Are these huge giants ready to do that?
I would say that the key question here is, what is the right profit? What is the right profit? Because at the end, we are not here to tell you you have to earn less, etc. But how do we share this value? And very clearly, one of the biggest challenges most companies are facing is, how do I avoid losing competitive advantage? So that means that everyone fears to do the right thing. And then we as country, we are pushing, because we are facing massive speculation that are still on. And it was mentioned earlier. So commodities are speculated, and the fundamentals of the market are not linked to the product, the raw material we want today. So all the consumer, everyone here wants a sustainable product. So what does that mean? Sustainability cannot be just farming practice. It cannot just be only social, but it has to be all the pillars. And the economic part is exactly what we are talking about. Mm-hmm. So for us, is how do we ensure that the market cannot be only associated to supply and demand, but need to include the sustainability fundamentals, meaning that farmers, when a company said, we want to buy a product, we want to do the right things, you need to ensure that your purchases practices are aligned with the clear goals, the sustainable goals, but also that you are not creating the poverty. And I think that's a governance that we need to see for this transparency, because there's often so much claims. And we are becoming more and more pressured, and this is showing where we are today.
And I want to come back to that longer-term picture and that longer-term struggle that you just outlined. But let me first stay with the role of industry in the short term, Matthias, and ask you what Bayer is currently doing. Because, in fact, you have been providing seeds and agricultural inputs to smallholder farmers in Ukraine, as I understand it. And beyond that, you've also seen an upturn overall in demand for weed killers and pest control products, with producers, of course, trying to raise yields in the face of the current situation. So to what degree can production be ramped up quickly to avert or at least mitigate crisis? And does that come at the price of organic farming and sustainability?
Yeah, let me start, Melina, to talk a bit about Ukraine. We experienced right at the beginning of the war that Russia, in their second invasion of Ukraine, was targeting food infrastructure. We are by far the largest seed producer in the corn area. Corn is quite important for Ukraine, and when your sites in the middle of nowhere are targets of like a cruise missile attacks, then you know that there is a plan behind what Putin is doing. He wants to destroy infrastructure in general. He is very focused on food. And that is a challenge I think we only can collectively respond to. Part of it is that we made sure during this year's crop season that farmers, by the way, not only small farmers in the Ukraine, some of them are also quite large, have access to seeds, get access to crop protection, get access to the fertilizers they need in order to produce. I think collectively, including with the help of the work of the UN, we were able to support the farming system quite well this year. I'm much more worried about the coming year, and the reason being that the destruction of infrastructure has not stopped. In some areas, it has accelerated. And to the second part of your question, there was a bit of a tendency of some to say, well, in this food crisis, we now need to really worry about food productivity, and that should take priority. I don't think it's a good idea, because what we are seeing is we face a biodiversity crisis. Agriculture is not only suffering, but also contributing to global warming. And that is why any of the solutions we talk about needs to solve for all three problems. It needs to provide enough food for the 8 billion people that are now on this planet. It needs to ensure that the biodiversity crisis is addressed. And then last but not least, it needs to decarbonize agriculture so that the quarter of the emissions that come from this sector, the share this sector has, is going down. And the solution for all of that is that we collaborate in very different ways and that we are open for all kinds of innovation.
Let us shift now to the longer-term view, but I would like to get Joachim's point of view on that same question, namely the trade-off between trying to feed an expanding population under circumstances in which we are seeing rising food insecurity as well as severe hunger, and basically whether we wind up using genetically modified crops, using fertilizers, using pesticides that in fact do even greater damage to the system as a whole.
Well, I prefer to look for synergies rather than trade-offs in the food system. And these synergies come mainly through innovations, investment in R&D and innovations to get us out of these severe constraints on the productivity side. So I agree that is critical for the long term. And fortunately, we have lots of progress in science that serves the environment and serves productivity and production and health. I underline the food system functioning relates to people health, farmer health, and children's health a lot, like no other sector. And that depends on earning income and producing. We must be aware that this food crisis is not just a price crisis. Prices matter for the hunger situation. And they matter for the long term. So if prices come down now, the crisis of those children and women hit by the high prices and had cut back on their consumption will linger on, especially for children. Our research shows that the stunting and even the mortality effects come in later when prices are gone and policymakers say, hooray, the crisis is over. It's not over for those who had been affected in the crisis, born at the wrong time, and so on. But once more, the power of science and innovation, including done with farming communities, on the ground is what brings us the synergies which we need, and then we overcome trade-offs.
And let's get some concrete examples of what that looks like, because innovation, Ertharin, is certainly a key focus of the advisory work that you are now doing. So could you share with us what you see as the most promising innovations, both in the technological arena, but also policy-related?
Sure, and I want to go back to the last question that you asked about the tools, whether when we're working to address the challenges of our food system, whether we have biological tools, including genetically engineered seeds, as well as new digital tools, is that a bad thing? The reality is that science and technology will bring us a diversity of new tools, including new biological tools. We all have CRISPR in our bodies now, CRISPR-based tools, based from the vaccines, and the same technology is being used to drive new seeds that are drought tolerant and drought resistant, that are wind resistant, short stature corn, for example, that Bayer is producing and now selling. In addition, these tools will allow us to do sustainable intensification of agriculture. We know that organics is one solution. Sustainable intensification is another solution. New digital tools that allow us to support our soils and providing them with the inputs that are necessary, and much more targeted and strategic. Moving from an extractive agriculture system to a regenerative agriculture system is key to supporting the production on land already under cultivation, to increase the production and value of that land, and to avoid increasing land under cultivation and further impacting biodiversity. All of those new tools that are coming online are necessary for us to feed the 9.5 billion people that are projected by 2050, but even more important, to feed the 8 billion people that we have here today. And so that is why the policies that are required we need the global policies to support the macro economy and that Joachim talked about with trade, but we also need micro-level policies that support the access and the production that is necessary for smallholder farmers.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask Matthias also to weigh in on this, because clearly Ertharin has just outlined a whole array of tools, but I found myself asking myself as she spoke, how accessible are those to smallholder farmers? For example, digitalization. I know that Bayer's doing a lot of work in the area of significantly boosting productivity through digital tools, but are those really usable and accessible for smallholder farmers?
I think generally speaking, smallholder farmers do not have enough access to innovation. And one of the things we changed when we looked at our general business strategy is we decided that the poorest farmers in the world shouldn't pay royalties for seeds. We also partnered with research institutions, with Gates, with many others, to ensure that some of the innovation is not only applied to the few cash crops we all know, but also to crops that are food staple, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, like cassava or like cowpea, which I think is really important. There are lots of orphan crops from our perspective that are pretty basic for sustaining lives, and in many countries for much more people than living in Europe today. But I see also something else. If you make those tools available, you have a lot of really ingenuity that comes from those countries. And in all of this mess, for me, one of the most inspiring examples is a small company that basically provides access to the satellite data that is being used for the large farms and digital agriculture for farmers that have like 1 or 2 hectares maximum. And they now provided this access to 165,000 farmers in Zambia and Kenya. So it's a pretty large sample. Their yields went up 2.5%. And that is because those farmers have a better understanding of how climate and weather is changing, and they have better access to financing, more predictable data on how the yields will unfold, and thus a better ability to also get funding for the inputs they need to be successful. For me, a yield increase of 250% or 2.5 times is what we need, but really to see all of those innovation being embraced by a generation of farmers in Africa. We always talk about the baby boomer generation being a bit old. In Africa, we have the baby boomer generation at the moment, and they're very young and much more innovative than we sometimes care to understand.
Alex, I saw you nodding when Matthias expressed the fact that farmers often don't have the access. Can you talk a little bit about what the farmers that you work with most need in terms of innovations?
I think Matthias said all, right? So they need innovation. Innovation is needed. Now the question is, how do you create a connection between someone who first interest or first worry is, how do I eat today, right? So when they wake up, the first issue is, how do I get food for lunch or even the day? So how do we bring that technology? So that means that there is a need for more engagement and more closer engagement. But then how do you create that incentive? And this is what brings us to the broader issue, is how do we create the right environment that builds incentive for farmer to do the right thing. One example is a farmer is being blamed because he went to the forest to plant or to destroy the forest. His first interest is, how do I get something that will provide me money? He doesn't think about the forest. But why? This is because the land he was on for many years is not producing. This is why technology is critical, but it doesn't have the investment. So what it's doing is expanding. So the challenge we have is, how do we do more on less land? But to achieve that, we need to create that paradigm shift. So the mindset of doing all this, willing all this, but then without changing certain tools. And the big things we are not talking all over in all these meetings, and I'm having few meetings again today, is sustainability. But no one wants to talk about how do we create that incentive? How do we create that market that will help deliver it? And I think that's critical. But also the other point that is important and good, sometimes in difficult situations, is that also the continent is realizing one thing, that the population is young, they have water, they have energy, they have everything, and the continent is thinking, wow, but then how do we eat? And how do we use things we produce? Because the example I gave earlier, the farmer that now realized, wow, fertilizer is 5 times more, so then I need to start thinking differently. So the countries are thinking differently. And it's bringing us to the mindset shift. And I think we will have to do the changes that is needed, the policy that is needed to produce more, and partnering with innovation to bring the right tools, the seedling, and all these things that are helping us doing better. But we need to still fill that gap, the incentive, because that farmer that is already the maximum of them, more than 80%, and you mentioned 800 million people, most of them are smallholders. So these people, until they will start figuring out what next or how the today will look like, then we will get really the big shift that we are looking for.
And I want to come back to the
Can I just have one point there
Sure,
that's
please.
really so critical, is that as you talk about bringing those solutions and the farmers helping themselves and the businesses, we must have finance. We have not talked about the issue of finance at all. It's so critical that we bring in new capital to support investments in market-based solutions that will allow for the increase in productivity that has just been described, not through just programs and donor contributions, but also through productive activity of business on the ground.
And one data point I wanted to add is that in cocoa sector and many raw materials, so the population is young, but surprisingly, the average age of cocoa farmers is 55 to 60 years old. Why? The young people don't even see any interest in cocoa, all right? And this is what we are trying to change. And this is linked to what I mentioned earlier, the incentive so that young people feel, wow, not just a hard work, but what are the technology, what are the tools that can make it better, and also for them to earn something.
Thank you very much. And you also made a point about deforestation that I want to come back to in just a moment. But let me first ask Joachim to talk a little bit more about inclusion in two different aspects. You headed the scientific group advising the UN Food Systems Summit last year, which of course was a summit that looked at this nexus between agriculture, biodiversity, and climate. And the aim was nothing less than the transformation of the global food system. So let me ask you, first of all, to what extent are the voices of the poorest and the most vulnerable heard in a forum like that?
Actually, there's some good news, at least if we compare this Food System Summit of last year with the 6 earlier Food System Summits which the world had since 1943. This was much more participatory, had a lot more voice from the countries and especially from indigenous peoples' communities. Indigenous peoples are the guardians of the majority of the agrobiodiversity and biodiversity in general. So they had voice, which is surprising. This was a conference of the United Nations, and the United Nations is a collection of nations and not of indigenous peoples or NGOs and so on, or the science community. I'm pleased with that summit because it also had a heavy emphasis on the innovation issues which the 3 colleagues just emphasized. So in that sense, glass certainly half full. The agenda at country level was well done. More than 100 countries are now implementing action programs following what they put on the table. Finance is a big problem. Earthreen, I think you emphasized a key issue. Why is finance currently not coming forward? Prices are high, investments should be beautiful, but they are not, because prices are not just high, they are volatile. And finance doesn't go where the risk is high. Agriculture is a risky business. That's why we need de-risking innovations. So I agree with what has been said on science and technology as absolutely critical, but we need also the institutional innovations, the empowerment of marginalized people, empowerment of women, the rights aspects related to land and to access to markets and so on. These institutional innovations are actually critical.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And finance was going to be my second point. So let me now move us all to climate change. We have very little time on the clock, but I do want to link all of this up to COP27, which of course is now meeting. So Alex, coming back to the point you made about deforestation, that essentially links up to a larger issue, which is this. Agriculture is one of the sectors most affected by climate change, but it is also a driver of the climate crisis. So in farming, that issue that you just mentioned, a farmer with less productive land starts expanding into the forest, which of course is a crucial carbon sink, in order to try to expand his production. And that leads to rapid deterioration. It's a vicious cycle, essentially, for many cocoa producing regions. How can you work to stop that?
So first of all, yes, that's a recognition. Now, how do we work to solve it? Everyone has a responsibility. So we have today, for example, the European Union, right, that is putting in place certain regulations. But still, these regulations, like many others, are still looking at how do we pressure the smallholders, the farmers, because look like it's fault. But unfortunately is experiencing the consequences of a global system, right? So I mentioned one, which is speculation, where we heard volatility and all this, but also we countries, so governments, are trying to do the best. But when we say cocoa, and cocoa is one of the drivers of deforestation, for example. So, but if countries, and I'm talking about all producing countries, represent almost 6% of this entire value. If you take Côte d'Ivoire alone, or Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire, probably the two together represent 3% of this value. So that means country. So if you remove all the cost, etc., so the farmer get probably less than 1%. So with this, how can we see investment, infrastructure that can support that? And I think that's one element. Secondly, we are facing lack of transparency. So everyone is buying cocoa all over, right? No one, and today traceability is a critical tool to get there, because that would help shaping the sector. But we government have done the mapping where forests are, where certain farmers have been identified, how do we remove them, what are the transitions, and all this. So I think there's a lot of work that's need to happen. The issue is protecting forests need to be rewarded. But today, it's probably cheaper to destroy the forest than protecting. Mm-hmm. So that's a very interesting situation. So how come can we today talk about deforestation? We are talking about finance, it's too risky. We are talking about buying transparently, so companies need to be able to tell where they're buying, because they are still buying from protected area. And then farmers are getting stuck in this circle and ending up in that environment. So everyone, and there are different tools that are needed from local policy, from global policy, but also if the European Union is doing a legislation, how much cocoa is entering Europe? What's about the rest? So probably the rest is what will continue, buying without checking where the cocoa is coming from, which will create probably much more issues. So how do we look at the global issues? How do we look at it seriously so that we can deliver the right impact? Because looking at only government and say, well, you are not doing anything, so we get limited by funding, we get limited by the outreach, but also we have a duty to protect forests. We have a duty, and we have to do it. Now we need to build that incentive that make really everyone getting to that point.
So if we ask what different stakeholders can do, let me come back once again to industry. And Matthias, I know that you and Earthrin, possibly the others as well, are all traveling to COP27. And the Egyptian hosts say they want this COP to be about adaptation, about helping those who are affected. Basically, that example that Alex just gave, the farmers being pressed to mitigate, where in fact, he should be helped to adapt. So in that context, interestingly enough, a survey has just come out showing that people around the world, they actually repose more trust in the agriculture industry than they do in many, many other industrial sectors, which I found quite fascinating. What can and should industry deliver at COP27?
Let me begin by saying that one of the big differences between COP26 in Glasgow and the COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh is that we have 2 dedicated days to the topic of agriculture on Saturday and to the topic of water the coming Monday. I mean, the idea that we try to talk about a just transition without talking about agriculture is in and itself flawed, and I think that's a big shift. So I have quite some hopes that this conversation will start and also continue in the COP cycle, and that agriculture, once on the agenda, will stay on the agenda. That wood is financially more attractive than a living forest. Alex just made that point. And my second hope is that with the political changes in Brazil, that we're going to see an alliance of the countries which, for example, are home to the rainforests, that they basically kind of present a joint group of countries that is not the problem, but asking for fair financial transfers, partially from the business community. Here, actually, German companies are quite leading in protecting nature, transferring money. Just yesterday was announced that more than $1 billion has been mobilized across industry in a program called LEAF, which doubled compared to last year. So something is happening here, but we now need much, much more. The second point I want to make is we need to protect forests not just for the reasons of biodiversity. There is this conversation about green water, water that is basically the result of living vegetation, Much of the rain that we see in East Africa, in West Africa, originates actually in rainforests in East Africa. And the reason why that is because the name rainforest gives us a cue. Yeah? It's not only about forests, it's also about rain and water. We got to do something about that. And one element is to enable farmers on their current farmland to produce more. And that is why access to fertilizer for smallholders at the moment is so important. Because without that, they are clearing more land to produce. Alex made that point in his observations right at the beginning. We see that around the world.
Thank you very much. I want to go to audience questions, but let me just get one or two sentences from each of you about what you think COP27 can and must achieve when it comes to agriculture. Earthryn, very brief, if you would.
First, from the government side, we need to ensure, if this is the adaptation COP, that is also the COP where governments come with the commitments to meet the financial stake or commitments that they made to the developed world for $100 billion, which has not been met since the commitment was made. Second, I'll go back to the financing question. Solving climate will require a whole of society solutions. That means that we need a capital stack that has private sector capital, but that is de-risked by concessionary capital from government above and beyond what governments commit to other governments. They need to commit to the business solutions that are necessary to move us forward.
Thank you. And Joachim, again and again, everybody at this table has said, our prices are skewed. We need a whole different pricing system in food and agriculture. Can a COP27 even hope to accomplish that?
We have pushed, in the context of the UN Food Systems Summit, the idea that we need to come to true prices. We, as the world, pay about $9 trillion per annum in the markets for the food which the 8 billion people buy. But the indirect costs, the environmental costs and the health costs, the obesity costs and so on, and the environmental costs of destroyed soils and so on, and the climate-related costs are twice that. So the total cost of the food system are about 28 trillion per annum, and not 9. So the markets are malfunctioning. Good food is not paid for at the right price, and so on. We need to fix that through regulation, incentives, and behavioral change.
Do you think the COP27 will take us in that direction? Yes or no?
Yes,
Okay,
yes, it
we're
will.
going to leave it there. Thank you so much. Let me go now to Adam and audience questions.
Thank you so much. Yes, we're fielding questions both from our online audience, so if you're watching online, please enter your questions there, as well as our physical audience. So if you here have a question, then please raise your hand. Hopefully someone will be able to come to you with the microphone in 1 second. But let's start with perhaps the billion-dollar question, which is that we started this conversation by talking about unprecedented hunger, but we're also talking about a time of unprecedented wealth, where the richest in our societies have gained ever more wealth. Are these interlinked, or are the solutions to these things interlinked?
Anybody?
I think there is a very important link, and that is best described with the word access. So there is a lot of richness, for example, currently happening in research and development. We see unprecedented progress at the intersection of biology, chemistry, and artificial intelligence. Earthryn, you mentioned vaccines as one example. We've seen access being a big topic during the pandemic. It's the same now. So in the very clear example for Bayer, we spend $2.5 billion every year for research and development in the agricultural space. How much of that is put against the problems smallholder farmers in East Africa, in Southeast Asia face? Are they ignored, or do we invest in that space? That is an example where wealth, in a sense of a rich arsenal of R&D opportunities, is being transferred in the direction of smallholders. And that's one of the questions we debate internally. My whole point internally is, you can't have a vision that says health for all, hunger for none, and then don't see a reflection in your R&D budget. And as a result of that, we are shifting our attention to places we haven't thought about 5 years ago.
I'd like to come to that question from a different angle, agreeing with you, but this massive growth of inequality in the world at country level and at global level fosters relative deprivation feelings. Out of that comes aggression, out of that comes conflict, and conflict is a key factor in the hunger equation. So I think we need to address that.
So, no, I think we have to accept that clearly we are in an environment where people need to be incentivized, right? So we are not attacking anyone in terms of wealth or everything. What we are looking is the share, the fair share. And if I look, for example, I would take back from a sector I'm in, the chocolate company industry. So when we looked at the profit or the earnings in comparisons to investment in sustainability, is a bit frustrating to see that most companies, when you make the calculation, is probably less than 1%, or at least 1% of the earnings is dedicated to sustainability. So I think there is a need for more, but it's not begging. It's how do we create that business model that is creating still earnings, but also that doesn't create poverty. And I think that link that we need to look at, because it's not about someone need to get less, but it's more how your profit can help also creating the right economical environment and ecosystem. And I think that's an area we need to explore more, because there are a lot of commitments. And sometimes I'm talking to people, they say, wow, that's a lot of money. These companies have made that commitment. But because people don't have the big picture to understand what is, 100 million, right, over 10 years. When you make that calculation and you look the size of the company, the impact and the profit, and all this, you realize that this is nothing. But this term, for someone who's probably an NGO or a small farmer or some of the countries, they see as, wow, that's big. But when you bring that to the right ecosystem, you realize that, in fact, that's a bit tiny. And we need to avoid this kind of commitment. Yes, we need more coherence. If one sector, and I think Matthias raised it, in the research, in some of the areas, there are good alliance, and we need, in the commodities areas also, we need a very good alliance with very focused target. Mm-hmm. And this focused target, we need to look at the purchasing practices, we need to look at how volatility can be mitigated so that we don't push the pressure only to the last mile, the farmer. So I think these are the things that we believe that need to happen.
Let me jump in there. We have a question from our audience. I don't know if we can get this member a mic. If not, I can repeat it.
If you say the question,
and then I can repeat it for our online.
Go.
Oh, here we go. Great, thanks.
Thank you for the great discussion. I must say I really enjoyed it, but I'm a little shocked that the word inclusion and gender justice was only brought up once by you. And I feel that, especially in the global south, where 80% of the world's population lives, where food scarcity is the biggest issue, we have not talked enough about women being able to actually have access to land ownership, which is a crucial thing, nor to innovation as such. So I would really like the whole group to maybe address this incredibly important point, please.
Okay, super short on time. Let's try to get to Earthrin and to Alex. Yeah.
We know that if women had the same access to land, seeds, finance, and tools, that we would increase the production of agriculture by 20%. That it's a requirement for us to achieve the sustainable transformation of the agriculture system, that we must address the gender equity challenge.
Thank you. Alex?
I think this is a good point, and this is spot on, and this is part of the things we need to talk about. How do we build the inclusion? But the inclusion, for me, is not just about women, not only about women. So we are talking about diversity in general, right? So there are many other things. Me, for example, I'm an African and I'm black. So now the question is, if I have to operate, or let's say if I'm somewhere, so how do I feel comfortable? And I think that's same for the women, and I think that's critical. So governments also have to take that in consideration. So more This calls, for example, is making some of the governments realizing, wow, when they look, they say, oh, we don't have even one woman minister. Wow, we need to change. And when I take the example of 1 or 2 governments I'm representing today, even by government, by cabinet, president cabinet, for example, now they're trying to look how to make more different people in, and women are included. But it's not enough. We need to do more in farming, how to ensure that they are not limited. So yes, I agree. I can only agree.
Matthias.
I'd like to add one concrete point to your question. One of the biggest risks for female farmers, apart from access to land, is pregnancy. And access to family planning is something we focus on a lot. It's part of the social innovation and focus on smallholder farms. Generally speaking, what we see, providing access to health, providing access to nutrition, for example, with school lunch programs, but most importantly, access to family planning helps those smallholder farmers to thrive. So that is something I think we certainly need to include in the conversation as well.
I'd add one word. Context is important. We need to localize our solution to ensure that we're meeting the needs of the diverse populations that we serve at the level where the work is being performed.
I see 0000 on our clock, so.
Unfortunately, that's all we have time for, but I'll hand back for our final thoughts.
Adam, thank you very much, and thanks so much for the great questions. So, ladies and gentlemen, that does wrap up this discussion on food insecurity and the path of the hunger hurricane. And certainly what I take away from it is that we urgently must begin to focus on the systemic nature of the crisis that we see, because, and we've heard it from all of the guests at this plenary table, the agricultural system cannot be seen separately from the climate system and, of course, also from biodiversity. And getting it right systemically does mean a joined-up approach, as all of you have talked about, joined up in the sense that all of us must do our part. Also, when it comes to the terms of trade and pricing, we must be ready to change our value that we put on food, and we must be ready to see those who produce our food remunerated in a way that creates incentives for them to raise production, that helps them to do so technologically, also in terms of skills, in order to ensure that that inequality, which of course also is a systemic problem, that we restore a measure of balance that does essentially link up the consumers in the rich countries, the producers in the poor countries, in a truly systemic approach to stopping that hunger hurricane. So many thanks to our panelists. Let's give them a warm round of applause. Thank you. Thank you to all of you for your attention and your contributions, and see you soon. Bye-bye.